This week we are learning about Transcendentalism, which is more or less American Romanticism, right? So the way I describe Transcendentalism is that it is Romanticism that has been Americanized, and then they add a few social causes to it, like abolition and suffrage and conservation. So that's to keep it as simple as possible. But based on what you remember, what are the major differences between Transcendentalism and Romanticism?
It focuses more on the youth,
Focuses more on what?
the individual, not
Yes.
the transcendentalism.
Yes, it does. That's good. Anything else you remember about the differences? Highest power? The self, right, as opposed to nature. So if nature is like the most powerful thing, if nature is the highest power in Romanticism, then Transcendentalism, the highest power is the self. Like all knowledge is self-knowledge. If you know yourself,
Then you can transcend.
you can transcend. It's really confusing because it's kind of like strange and odd. If you just keep to the whole idea that they really liked nature, like the Romantics, and that they also were involved in social causes and were trying to be the best versions of themselves, then you pretty much have it under control. Who is the father of Transcendentalism then?
The guy that talked to Emmanuel Kant.
Ralph Waldo Emerson. He's our dude.
Didn't him and Kant have like a relationship or something?
He and who?
Emmanuel Kant.
I mean, I think he might have known Immanuel Kant. I don't remember if I talked about that.
About it said something.
Yeah, well, Immanuel Kant was the one who used the term Transcendentalism first. And then Ralph Waldo Emerson literally formed a club. He's like, let's make a transcendental club. And so all of these writers were friends, including Bronson Alcott, who was the father of Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Little Women, which is the play this fall. So all of those things are kind of related to one another. Do you remember who the Transcendentalist writers are? We had Ralph Waldo Emerson. Hi, here.
Give me a second.
We had Henry David Thoreau. Yeah, Thoreau.
How far could he throw?
We had Channing.
Ellery Channing. Bronson Alcott.
Margaret Fuller.
Yes.
Henry David.
And Emerson.
Amos
Yes.
Bronson Alcott.
Amos. But yes. Something that I haven't talked about that I want to touch on just really quickly is that there were American writers who called themselves the dark romantics. Like they saw themselves as like pensive and moody and all that. Edgar Allan Poe is one of the dark romantics, okay? He was not a transcendentalist. That I would not describe him as a transcendentalist. He was a capital R romantic, right? Believed in powerful emotions and nature and that kind of thing and the supernatural, but like markedly different from the romantic view that people are good, wouldn't you say? So the dark romantics would include Edgar Allan Poe, Herman Melville, who wrote Moby Dick, the White Whale, and Nathaniel Hawthorne. Remember I told you about during the Crucible, the Judge Hawthorne guy?
Yeah.
His ancestor, or not his ancestor, his descendant, that's the right word, was Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote the Scarlet Letter, which was a scathing indictment of Puritanism. He's like, Puritans suck, including my relatives. And so Nathaniel Hawthorne changed his name to not be associated with to not be associated with Judge Hathorne from the Salem witchcraft trials. And Nathaniel Hawthorne was also a dark romantic.
Wait, what did he change his name?
It was Hawthorne, just with a W.
Oh.
So Judge Hathorne, no W. Nathaniel Hawthorne with a W.
I thought he like actually changed
No, he only separated himself by one letter.
Still sounds the same.
It does. It does. Did we grasp the concept of the oversoul?
No.
Everyone's soul is connected.
You have a soul, I have a soul, everyone has a soul. We are connected. We are one Om. Yes, Om. All right. So, I say this because here I was gone when we were learning Transcendentalism, and Transcendentalism, as I said, was confusing. How about we do something which is, in my opinion, a little more enjoyable, and that's actually digging into Transcendentalism by looking at Walden.
Yeah, sure. Why not?
So, Ralph Waldo Emerson was the father of Transcendentalism. If he was the father, then I guess that Henry David Thoreau would be his son, right? The son of Transcendentalism. So that is where we will pick up today. And many thanks to Mrs. Eckert for making everything work yesterday so you would actually get your lesson. Okay. Okay, I'm going to show you some pretty pictures here. Sound good? All right. So Henry David Thoreau was a friend and student, bless you, of Ralph Waldo Emerson's, right? Remember, if you remember, Emerson was a minister. He was a Unitarian minister, but he kind of decided to not quite form his own religion, but form his own philosophy and ideas of spirituality. Not exactly a cult leader, more of a thinker, right? Like Plato or Socrates. But one of his followers was Henry David Thoreau. So he said, we talk a lot about being close to nature, but all of us like live in the city. We have lots of money and we're super well educated. We claim that people don't need education and they don't need to live in the city, but that's what we do. I want to go to the woods for like as long as it takes to figure out how to live. And so Emerson was like, I've got a cabin on the lake. So if you want to go to Walden, you're welcome to. So Thoreau was like, thanks, man. I appreciate it. So he went out to the cabin and then he wrote a book called Walden. Walden was about nature and living on his own. One caveat though. As much as Henry David Thoreau wrote about living in nature and relying on the earth and living on his own, he actually went back into town as often as he needed to, where his mother still did his laundry. Just had to add that little note there. So he said this. He said, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. So his intentions were good, right? He really wanted to go out and make sure he was really living, not just surviving, not just going through his days. So that's why he went to the woods. This is the cabin that, it's a replica of the original cabin, but Emerson gave him a cabin to live in, and he fixed it up so it would actually make it through the winter and everything. So this is the little replica Thoreau cabin on Walden Pond. This is in Massachusetts, right? Close to Concord. Here's an aerial view of Walden Pond.
Why does it look like Texas?
Does it?
No.
It looks beautiful in the fall, though. Massachusetts in the fall is gorgeous.
One little point, that's it, so Texas.
Geez,
It
how
looks like
stereotypical of you.
So it's not gigantic, but it's a pretty good sized little pond or lake here. Here it is in the fall on the shore right outside of the cabin. A friend of mine who was an English major, she and her boyfriend, now husband, he proposed to her on Walden Pond, and that was like a whole thing. It's supposed to be beautiful, romantic, transcendent even, if you will.
There's not in Texas, bro.
Yes, it does. You have this little bar up here. You have this little twitch.
If you look here, here's the pond in winter. We're actually going to be reading a little bit about that.
It's literally just.
It's 11.
I don't think this is his building. I think that might even be like the visitor center or something, right? It's now a historic site. Here's the inside of that cabin. Probably more furnished than it was when Thoreau was in there. Like those are some pretty nice windows, and I'm pretty sure he had to actually fill up the chinks in the cabin with like clay and stuff because it wasn't very airtight for the winter. It was pretty cold. So you can see he had a place to sit and eat, place to write, place to sleep. And he did occasionally have someone out there. Like he says he was alone, but I think it's fair to say that Thoreau got as much company as he would like, right? Thoreau was like the ultimate introvert. I mean, he was happy to be by himself, but when he wanted to be around people, he'd seek them out on his own. And that's something that they really don't talk about in his writings. A lot of people say he was a hypocrite. They say, "Oh, you want to go live off the earth? You want to go do all this, but you're willing to go back into town and have your mom do your laundry." That's rather hypocritical, right? He wasn't the forager that people made him out to be. But I want you to judge him based on his own writing and his story, and see what you think from there. So, if you have your book, and I hope you do, if you do not have your book, you can grab one from the back shelf. We are gonna do a little Walden talking. And I'm gonna unhook and grab a book myself.
You just memorize it.
Oh yeah, for sure. You'd be surprised by how much I do have memorized, but
No, I wouldn't be surprised. That's why you have a whole thing memorized.
all right.
It's like you got every word you say memorized. It's really good.
Nah, too many ums for that. Okay, so in your book, Walden starts on page 207. I'm gonna pause recording here and see if I can
I have literally
get it on the document camera.
all these you said.
All right, here is Walden by Henry David Thoreau. So if you look at the top, it gives you his birth and death dates. He was born in 1817 and died in 1862. So literally like right in the middle of the Civil War. He was from Concord, and he was a transcendentalist, like his friend and mentor. As I said, Ralph Waldo Emerson was his teacher. He was well educated. He graduated from Harvard, and he was a school teacher. And then he decided to become a nature poet. That's the kind of economy apparently that they were living in, where you could be like, you know what I want to do? Be a nature poet. It's hard to imagine that kind of job is practical these days.
Can't you still do that? Tell a poet.
I suppose you could. Pretty hard to make money. So in 1845, he decided to do his experiment about living in the woods. And so the cabin he lived on, like I said, belonged to Emerson. Let me get you. There we go. Get us there. He wrote Walden, and Walden is a book, but it's also a collection of essays. So the essay form is still going strong from the revolutionaries, right? They wrote speeches, they wrote essays, they wrote letters to the editor. During this era, essays and poetry were our main forms of writing. So his most famous essay is actually called Civil Disobedience. And it's a word that we've come to use whenever we describe a nonviolent protest. Martin Luther King talked about civil disobedience. And that term is one that really Thoreau popularized. Basically, the tax collectors came along and were like, hey, Henry, pay your taxes. And he's like, totally. Is it going to go to roads and schools and that kind of thing? And they're like, nah, man, we're fighting the Civil War. And he's like, okay, then no thanks. I don't want to then. They're like, dude, you got to pay your taxes. He's like, I don't really want to pay for the war. Can my taxes go to like, the good things? They're like, no. And he's like, well, then throw me in jail. And so they did. So he stayed there, wrote his essay, and eventually they let him go. But he said, it's the right of an individual to follow your conscience rather than obey a law that is unjust. Says this law literally makes me act unjustly toward my neighbor by forcing me to be a part of this war in a way that I don't want to. And so he was a fiery, feisty guy for an introvert. So we're going to look at the first part of Walden here. I'm going to read, but I'm also going to talk a little bit. He has these long, sprawling sentences. Like a sentence can last a paragraph in Thoreau, which makes it somewhat difficult to read. So you got to just break it up by thought. At least Walden is set up in essays, so like he tells you what you're supposed to be looking for. So I want you to do this. This is something I do every year. When you find something that's particularly quotable or seems like wisdom to you, drop a sticky there. Like, this still seems wise. This still makes sense. I like that. Drop a sticky. If there is another one with which you strongly disagree, or you're like, oh my gosh, no, definitely not, drop a sticky there. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking for relevance and seeing what we think. So I'm going to read, and I'll make sure I stop every so often and take questions as well. When first I took up my abode in the woods, that is, began to spend my nights as well as days there, which by accident was on Independence Day or through the 4th of July, 1845, my house was not finished for winter, but was merely a defense against the rain, without plastering or chimney, the walls being of rough, weather-stained boards with wide chinks which made it cool at night. The upright, white-hewn studs and freshly planed door and window casings gave it a clean and airy look, especially in the morning when its timbers were saturated with dew, so that I fancied that by noon some sweet gum would exude from them. I was seated by the shore of a small pond, about 1.5 miles south of the village of Concord, and somewhat higher than it, in the midst of an extensive wood between that town and Lincoln, and about 2 miles south of that our only field known to fame, Concord Battleground. But I was so low in the woods that the opposite shore, 1/2 mile off like the rest, covered with wood, was my most distant horizon. So where he's sitting, he's actually really close to civilization, but his actual point of view is just covered in trees, right? Like it looks like he's in the middle of nowhere, but he's really not. For the first week, whenever I looked out on the pond, it impressed me like a tarn high up on the side of a mountain, its bottom far above the surface of other lakes. And as the sun arose, I saw it throwing off its nightly clothing of mist, and here and there by degrees its soft ripples or its smooth reflecting surface was revealed, while the mists, like ghosts, were stealthily withdrawing in every direction into the woods, as at the breaking up of some nocturnal conventicle. It's interesting that he uses this word because it makes it sound like he's talking about the Salem witchcraft trials, like there was like a coven of witches meeting in the woods. He's describing the mist rising off the lake, like scattering, right? And so at this point in time, they were finally able to like, not necessarily laugh at that history, but like it wasn't looming so large in their past, right? They were really leaving that Puritan idea behind, that he was able to talk about the mists rising like a conventicle of witches or of ghosts. The very dew seemed to hang upon the trees later into the day than usual, as on the sides of mountains. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear. Nor did I wish to practice resignation unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms. And, if it proved to be mean, why then to get the whole and genuine meanness of it, and publish its meanness to the world. Or if it were sublime, to know it by experience, and be able to give a true account of it in my next excursion. For most men, it appears to me, are in a strange uncertainty about it. That's life. Whether it is of the devil or of God, and have somewhat hastily concluded that it is the chief end of man here to glorify God and enjoy him forever. So, what does Thoreau believe to be true about life and living based on what we're reading here? I need your help. Even saying something like, I did not wish to live what was not life. I guess what counts here is not life. What is not living? Doing things that you don't want to do, or doing things that you don't care about doing, right? And also to do things that are unnecessary, I think, right? He wants to live very simply, right? He only wants to have to take care of himself, not have to worry about anybody else. Still we live meanly like ants, though the fable tells us that we were long ago changed into men. Like pygmies, we fight with cranes. It is error upon error and cloud upon clout, and our best virtue has for its occasion a superfluous and inevitable wretchedness. Wow. So apparently it's not so much fun to be a person. He's like, sometimes we act like we're miserable, just all the time. We're miserable. Doesn't have to be that way. Our life is frittered away by detail. An honest man has hardly need to count more than his 10 fingers, or in extreme cases, he may add his 10 toes and lump the rest. Simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. I say, let your affairs, and by affairs, he's not talking about extramarital, he's talking about business affairs. Let your affairs be as one or two or three, and not 100 or 1,000. Instead of 1,000,000, count half a dozen, and keep your accounts on your thumbnail. So this is getting to that idea that you should not be in debt to anybody else, right? That you shouldn't depend on anyone except for yourself, which is easy for someone who came from wealth to say, right? In the midst of this chopping sea of civilized life, such are the clouds and storms and quicksands and 1,001 items to be allowed for, that a man has to live if he would not founder and go to the bottom and not make his port at all by dead reckoning. And he must be a great calculator indeed who succeeds. Is this still true? Are the people who are great calculators the ones who we think are successful, the one who have so many things going on all at once, or who are handling multiple things all at the same time? If someone says you're a good multitasker, is it a compliment or not?
Yes.
Just a statement.
We put a lot of store in being busy. When people ask how you're doing, the most common response you get, at least from adults, is busy or tired. Well, I get both of those. Thoreau says, do we actually have to be busy, or do we just think we're supposed to be busy? Is it considered a badge of honor to always be doing something, to always be working on something, to feel like you have to multitask? He says, Maybe we don't need to. Simplify, simplify. Instead of 3 meals a day, if it be necessary, eat but 1, as long as it's not just breadsticks, right?
Yeah.
Instead of 100 dishes, 5, and reduce other things in proportion. Why should we live with such hurry and waste of life? We are determined to be starved before we are hungry. Men say that a stitch in time saves 9, and so they take 1,000 stitches today to save 9 tomorrow. As for work, we haven't any of consequence. We have the St. Vitus's dance, which is interesting because that's like an old word for epilepsy, like people who don't have control over their own limbs. And he's like, yeah, we're jerked around everywhere. We cannot possibly keep our heads still. If I should only give a few pulls at the parish bell rope as for a fire, that is, without setting the bell, there is hardly a man on his farm in the outskirts of Concord, notwithstanding that press of engagements which was his excuse so many times this morning, nor a boy nor a woman, I might almost say, but all would forsake all and follow that sound, not mainly to save property from the flames, but if we will all confess the truth, much more to see it burn, since burn it must, and we, be it known, did not set it on fire, or to see it put out, and have a hand in that, if that is done as handsomely. Yes, even if it were the parish church itself. Are people like that? Do we like to see terrible things happen? Or are we curious about them?
You don't like it, but we're curious.
He's like, there's a lot of awful things that we, are able to see. And he's like, and we want to see them. That curiosity we have to be in other people's business is strong. It's like maybe we should resist it a little bit. Hardly a man takes a half hour's nap after dinner, but when he wakes, he holds his head up and asks, "What's the news?" as if the rest of mankind had stood his sentinels. Some give directions to be waked every half hour, doubtless for no other purpose, and then, to pay for it, they tell what they have dreamed. After a night's sleep, the news is as indispensable as the breakfast. Pray tell me anything new that has happened to a man anywhere on this globe, and he reads it over his coffee and rolls. That a man has had his eyes gouged out this morning on the Wachito River, never dreaming the while that while he lives in the dark, unfathomed mammoth cave of this world, and has but the rudiment of an eye himself. Thoreau says maybe we don't want to know certain things. Maybe it's okay to be less connected instead of more connected, which is an odd thing to say because our society values being connected. He's like, I don't really need the post office. I think there are a few important communications made through it. To speak critically, I never received more than 1 or 2 letters in my life that were worth the postage. The penny post is commonly an institution through which you seriously offer a man that penny for his thoughts, which is so often safely offered in jest. And I am sure that I never read any memorable news in a newspaper. If we read of 1 man robbed or murdered or killed by accident, or 1 house burned, or 1 vessel wrecked, or 1 steamboat blown up, or 1 cow run over on the Western Railroad, or 1 mad dog killed, or 1 lot of grasshoppers in the winter, we never need read of another. 1 is enough. It's like, you know what? Are you as sick of this as me? Here's what we do. Let us spend 1 day as deliberately as nature, and not be thrown off the track by every nutshell and mosquito's wing that falls on the rails. Let us rise early and fast, or breakfast, gently and without perturbation. Let company come and let company go. Let the bells ring and the children cry, determined to make a day of it. Time is but the stream I go a-fishing in. I drink at it. But while I drink, I see the sandy bottom and detect how shallow it is. Its thin current slides away, but eternity remains. I would drink deeper. Fish in the sky, whose bottom is pebbly with stars. I cannot count 1. I know not the first letter of the alphabet. I have always been regretting that I was not as wise as the day I was born. The intellect is a cleaver. It discerns and rifts its way into the secret of things. I do not wish to be any more busy with my hands than is necessary. My head is hands and feet. I feel all my best faculties concentrated in it. My instinct tells me that my head is an organ for burrowing, as some creatures use their snout and forepaws, and with it I would mine and burrow my way through these hills. I think that the richest vein is somewhere hereabouts, so by the divining rod and thin rising vapors I judge, and here I will begin to mine. So this whole section is really kind of like odd here. But if you stop and think that this is a philosophy, that this is a way of thinking about things, and not necessarily a story, it makes it a lot easier. He says, time is but the stream I go a fishing in, right? If time isn't that important, then you can feel free to waste it and use it however you need it, as opposed to how other people tell you to do it with a schedule, right? He says, I see the sandy, I drink it up, but while I drink, I see the sandy bottom and detect how shallow it is. Its thin current slides away, but eternity remains. So he's combining nature with the idea that you need to let yourself go a little bit, right? So when he's out at the pond and he's looking into the bottom and he sees the fish and he sees the pebbles and everything, he lets himself go. He forgets that he has things he has to worry about. He forgets the first letter of the alphabet. He forgets that he's even human. He's just kind of a part of the universe, right? This is the whole transcendental thing. But they're like, you want to be one with the universe. So that's what we have going on in that section. This phrase, I have always been regretting that I was not as wise as the day I was born. If you remember from the lecture yesterday, why might babies be considered wise to transcendentalists? Why is a baby wiser than the oldest man who ever lived, according to the transcendentalists? Because they are what? It's not because they're babies. It's because they're innocent, right? A baby doesn't know how to murder people, right? As a generalized rule. A baby doesn't know how to murder people. A baby doesn't know to do things that they shouldn't, right? Babies are innocent. So in that way, the world makes its impressions upon them. So when he says, I've always been regretting that I was not as wise as the day I was born. Once you've seen something, you can't unsee it. Once you've learned something, you can't unlearn it. But babies, they're a blank slate, according to Thoreau, right? And so that blank slate makes them wise rather than being written upon by experience and crooked people and terrible things. So what I'm going to do next here is I'm going to assign you a section to read and to glean out what is going on in it. If you are joining us remotely, we are going to make it through probably just Solitude in the Pond in Winter. And tomorrow we'll probably mess with Spring and Conclusion. So that will be the goal, will be to finish Walden tomorrow. And on Monday, we will be writing an in-class essay about Walden. All right. Thanks, Katara. We'll see you later.